Thank you. I really should applaud you guys for all being here. So with that, we'll start the show. First of all, good evening to all of you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Really, really appreciate it. On behalf of the Smith Board of Trustees, I would like to welcome you officially to the 36th Annual W. Eugene Smith Memorial Fund Award presentation. I'd like to also take just a quick moment and thank the School of Visual Art for donating this beautiful theater, and in doing so, making this evening possible for us. So thank you, SVA. Gene Smith was an early pioneer in the art of storytelling through the photographic essay. He was a master of humanistic photography. He accomplished this by entrenching himself into the life of his subjects. He was a champion of those in need and of those in the margin, effectively giving a voice to those who have no voice of their own. He documented the human condition, but did so in a way that brought compassion and dignity to his subjects. His principal concern in his work was the truthfulness. He did not fall short. His essays often challenged and inspired the viewer to take action. In the age of digital photography and distribution, we cannot help but feel besieged by a constant stream of images all around us. Sometimes it's hard to make sense of them all. Oftentimes, we just feel overwhelmed or totally disconnected to them. As Doug Brinkley, professor of history at Rice University, said, once in a while, an image breaks through the noisy, cluttered global culture and hits people in the heart and not in the head. Photographer Eddie Adams once wrote, "Still photographs are the most powerful weapons in the world." Indeed, the still image has the power to be transformative. It doesn't happen every day, but when it does, the image is seared into our collective consciousness. Some iconic images to come to mind are the flag raising at Iwo Jima by Joe Rosenthal, and later the firefighter raising the flag in the rubble of the World Trade Center on the evening of 9/11 by Thomas Franklin. The kiss in Times Square on VJ Day by Alfred Eisenstadt. Or Albert Einstein with his tongue sticking out by Arthur Sass. And who can forget the image of young JFK Jr. saluting his father's coffin taken by Stan Stern. Or Kevin Carter's image of starving Sudanese girl with a vulture waiting in the wings. More recently, the world was taken back by the image of the lifeless body of the Syrian boy Aylan Kurdi, who had washed up on the Turkish beach resort. The image taken by Nilüfer Demir resonated with the world. For the last few years, we have seen pictures of countless Syrian refugees, yet that single image was the one to break through the clutter. That image successfully connected the viewer to the subject. Throughout his career, that is what Smith strived for. Whether documenting harsh realities, conflict and suffering, or everyday life, his goal was to connect his audience with his subjects. His photographs are honest and authentic, with the power to touch people, create awareness, and change minds. I'm pleased to tell you that our finalists and recipients tonight all embody the spirit of Smith. They documented the human condition through their storytelling with dignity and compassion for their subjects. Tonight, we award the Smith Grant in Humanistic Photography for the 36th time. We will view and celebrate the work of the grant recipient, the finalist, and the fellowship recipient, as well as the Howard Chapnick Grant recipient. Perhaps documentary filmmaker and historian Ken Burns summed it up best when he said, "Still photographs are the DNA of our visual experience. We are brought together by them." And on that note, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Mr. Jim Estrin. Jim has been with the New York Times since 1987 and is currently a senior staff photographer. He's also a co-founder and co-editor of The Lens, the Times photography blog. Ladies and gentlemen, you already done so. Let's give him another warm welcome to Jim Estrin.
Hi. When I was 16, I picked up my father's old East German-made Exacta camera and started to photograph. Within 6 months, I knew precisely what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I wanted to be Eugene Smith. My father had a series of Time Life books on photography, and I studied Smith's work. Country Doctor, Spanish Village, Albert Schweitzer, World War II. I learned to develop film and print in a darkroom, and I photographed constantly. But other than my books, I had little guidance. So I decided that I had to meet Eugene Smith and find out the secrets of how to make photographs that were so humane and so alive. At 17, I applied to take a 2-weekend workshop at the International Center of Photography with Smith. I brought my portfolio of street portraits to ICP to be interviewed to show I was advanced enough to be in the workshop. Not surprisingly, at 17, it was thought I might need a little more time. But Via Winroth reviewed my portfolio and changed my life. She gave me a scholarship to a lecture series that included a presentation by Eugene Smith of his new work, Minamata, that he had spent 2 years making. 40 years later, I vividly remember his talk as if it were yesterday. He cried several times as he spoke about the children who were poisoned in Minamata and the savage beating that he had taken at the hands of company thugs. When he showed the photo of Tomoko Yamura being bathed by her mother, I understood exactly how powerful a single image could be. Afterwards, I shook his hand, and I saw how frail he had become. I never saw Eugene Smith again, but the power of his images has influenced everything I have done in photography. I wish I could say I followed in his footsteps, but in reality, I became a newspaper photographer who has the good fortune to work for the New York Times. 6 years ago, I helped found the Lens blog, which I co-edit with David Gonzalez, and together with our producer, Whitney Richardson, we try to encourage photographers to strive to follow in Smith's footsteps and pursue the work that is most important to them. One of my underlying principles in starting Lens was that photographs do not happen by themselves. They happen because of photographers. And great photographs happen because of passionate, stubborn, and obstinate photographers, like Eugene Smith. When I teach, I tell my students that there's a lot of good work, but very little great work, and that there's a big difference between the two. Great work comes from time spent, passion, and obsession, which pretty well defines how Eugene Smith approached photography. Eugene Smith was not a perfect human being. He was, to put it mildly, difficult. But he was beautifully flawed, like a singular, precious gem. It is because of him that we all believe that it's possible to put photographs together to tell the important stories that we are driven to tell. It's fitting that we gather here today in his name to honor new generations of passionate, stubborn, and obsessed photographers who are producing great socially concerned work. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Dale Kaplan, and I've been asked to talk about collecting as it relates to the legacy of Eugene Smith. Smith's legacy of positivist engagement, his intention to employ pictures to address the harsh realities of the human condition, is far-reaching and continues to add dimension to the worlds of photography, photojournalism, and visual culture. Although Smith is known for his picture essays and photo stories, singular images best represent his iconography. His extraordinary ability to tap into a range of humanistic issues include those that are all too familiar, the ravages of war. He put himself in harm's way. He created great images and also made the finest analog photographic prints. This two-part approach is at the very core of his artistic vision: image and object. He coaxed out subtleties in the negative, pushing the boundaries of the wet darkroom. Many of the political, social, and environmental topics and themes that preoccupied him over the course of his long career, which were fresh to public consciousness at that time, continue to be concerns today. Radiation poisoning, healthcare for all, environmental disaster, corporate irresponsibility, contamination of water tables. Smith's pictorial vocabulary found its ultimate expression in low-light imagery, resulting in highly nuanced photographic prints. He photographed during a period when the so-called picture magazines, Life and Look, were in their heyday. Although he made work for the printed page for editorial and reproduction purposes, he spent long periods of time in a wet darkroom, finessing medium and large format prints. That he did this at a time when the market for photography was emerging and quite tiny, and was considered an illegitimate art form, speaks to the precedence of the photographic print in his imagination. Prints ensured his legacy. He interpreted topics that were considered unusual, emotional, sometimes even controversial. Yet readers responded favorably, recognizing the newness, the freshness of the pictorial experience. His photo essay about Maud Cullen in 1951, Nurse Midwife, resulted in a torrent of financial public support so that Cullen was able to open her own healthcare facility. Crowdsourcing, 1951. Smith was a father and an artist with cultural ambition. His pictures, though sometimes poignant, have an inherent optimism. He found meaning through images. He believed photography mattered. All of us in this room subscribe to the same belief system.
Hi, I'm Bill Hunt. Thank you very much. Each year at this time, at this event, we try to include a short homage to Eugene Smith with images or events that are not very familiar, and this search often falls to me. Sam Stevenson is probably the best writer dealing with Smith, and the biography he's been writing for many, many years has become his own ongoing Pittsburgh, Smith's notorious, massive, and unfinished photo essay for Life magazine. In 2009, Stevenson published his evocative and thoroughly researched Jazz Loft project, and he debuted it here. In a recent piece for the Paris Review, Sam wrote about the relationship between Smith and the playwright Tennessee Williams. Smith was dispatched by Life magazine to shoot Williams shortly after his legendary A Streetcar Named Desire opened on Broadway. Smith made the photographs in January 1948, and some of these were published in Tennessee Williams at Home in Life, February 16, 1948. From that issue of Life, it appears that Smith shot the principal portrait and one of Williams playing cards backstage that exactly mimics a scene from the play. Both men were searchers. Imagine these two dark souls, these thunderously creative and self-destructive talents at age 36 and 29 respectively. The quotes that follow belong to them, and they are literally interchangeable. See if you can identify who said what. Smith was a huge fan of Williams, according to Stevenson. Smith was theater obsessed, and it was one of his most important influences in that playwrights like O'Neill, Williams, and Sean O'Casey, quote, helped him solve problems in his photography, continuing the quote, the visual sequences of literary and staged drama, the buildup or tension and the release he sought to achieve in his photojournalism. It was a blend of pure documentary work and Smith's romantic, melancholy, sometimes melodramatic cast of mind. I actually stacked the deck. It was all Williams first, and then it's Smith afterwards. A delightful and completely unexpected windfall for us is indeed this final shot of Williams swimming, naked, reportedly with an erection. Now, some of you may choose to believe that it was just a trout swimming perilously close to his groin. Like much of Smith's work, it did not make the final edit. Thanks very much.
Hi there, everybody. Good to be here, and thanks everybody for coming. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Chapnick Grant winner. It's come a long way since Rich Clarkson and Brian Lanker established it in 1996. That year, less than a dozen entries were received. This year, we had 88, and about 15 of them were really very excellent. It's a tribute to Howard, who was a mentor and inspiration to several generations of photojournalists. He co-founded the Eugene Smith Fund, as you know, was a principal in the Black Star Agency. He mounted exhibitions, was an educator, and was always there when you needed him. His influence continues today. Over the years, the recipients have come from many different parts of the world, including Great Britain, Russia, China, Bangladesh, Thailand, and of course the United States, helping a vast array of projects that are promoted, what is that feedback? That has promoted social change for education or served significant concerns of photojournalism. Tonight, we want to thank the Harbers Family Foundation for sponsoring this year's grant. The 2015 grant recipients project Pixel Nation, a documentary film, will explore social and political implications of the massive volume of shared digital imagery we all generate today. Here's a short video.
Now, the easiest way you've ever seen to put good times in movies.
Kodak film for the times of your life.
the person who filmed the video is a hero.
No justice!
No peace!
Times Square is covered with protesters. There's about 20 riot cops.
Now, Tom Garber, here is your check. That's a gorgeous start.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here among all these wonderful photographers and dignitaries. Short speech. Pixel Nation is a 90-minute documentary film which follows the evolution of photography from when George Eastman introduced us as the Kodak camera as a way to record our personal memories, and then to today, when digital imagery has changed the way we communicate and has become an agent of social and political change. The genesis of this project began when I realized that all my childhood memories were related to imagery, either a photograph, a motion picture film, or a slide. And I began to realize how powerful these imageries are. Did I remember anything that wasn't photographed? What if there wasn't a camera? Then I started thinking about the volume of digital imagery today and how it has changed our lives. The exponential growth of number of photographs taken is astronomical, and the power of that, and how now a photograph has become something as a way to communicate with each other and not just to preserve memories. The days when we went out and got a roll of film, had it processed, waited for the print to come back, has changed. There was a digital photograph now. One picture costs just as much as 1 million pictures. So now we use that as a way to communicate with each other. And with the advent of the cell phones, 90% of our population now is armed with a camera. Everything is recorded. We're being recorded here tonight. The implications of that, those photographs, those images being uploaded and transferred around the world, has changed the way we look at ourselves, and it changes the social and political nature of imagery. And I think it's important for this film to try to put a context on that and make us understand where we came from with this and how we got here. And with that knowledge, we can maybe make a better assessment of future technologies. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure I remember exactly when I first met Eli, but I do remember when he sent me photographs at Time magazine in 1983 when he was covering the conflict in Beirut, Lebanon. And I remember that Eli was so dedicated to recording with great compassion the lives of the people who were stuck in the middle of the conflict, and not just the fighters, which is what the magazine often wanted. And that impressed me. Then a few years later, I was watching a TV documentary about Jacob Riis, who had reported and later learned how to photograph the overcrowding in the Lower East Side of New York in the late 1800s. And there were several photographers also in the program who were documenting things that needed to be fixed, and Eli was one of those. And I remember he was doing a story about a young man named Tito who lived in the Jacob Riis housing project that was similar to the Delaney project, Eli, where you grew up in New Jersey. Eli was on the roof with Tito, and Tito was preparing to shoot up a speedball. And Eli wanted to cry. But then he thought, why am I here? And if I don't make photographs of Tito's life, then what am I doing here? Eli needed to be a witness so others might know. Again, I could see that Eli had a great deal of concern for people whose lives he would show. In 1992, Eli received the W. Eugene Smith Grant to work on his project Going Home, Crisis in Black America, that he's continued to work on today. For many years, he has documented the tragedies, but also the triumphs of Black America. Eli is a humanitarian, no doubt, who passionately and compassionately cares about people and their conditions. He is one of the great witnesses of human behavior today. Eli, you are. Here are some of the images from his project, and then Eli will come up and say a few words about Smith and the grant.
You know, okay. Elaine LaFont said something to me once. Robert Platts, Elaine LaFont, and some really good people were very helpful. And she said to me, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're a concerned photographer, you know? And I was really pleased, but she was warning me it was going to be very painful. That's what I've always remembered that. That's one of the things you can't help but remember. Thank you. Robert Stevens and Bill Pierce, who was the chief photographer in Beirut, were sort of, how would you call it, personal angels, guardians for me, in a certain kind of way. It's like, it was part of the learning curve when you have people who talk to you and tell you things and encourage you. And the Eugene Smith Foundation has been one of those places. In 1975, I was in the workshop with Gene Smith at ICP, and Via Rendif again, she was the one who encouraged me. She said the first day I showed portfolio, and she said, "You must work harder. Now, at the time, I was doing 20-hour days, no sleep, just crazy. And I wondered, what is she talking about? But I discovered what she was talking about because Bruce Davidson and Gene Smith were amazing. Forget it.
Robin Hammond is one of the most passionate, prolific, and generous photojournalists in the field. His curiosity has been his most sacred compass, leading him to the far corners of the world, recording the plight of social injustices and human rights. His eye is exquisite, yet always evolving. He has the instinct of a great journalist. Robin is a realist. He understands that a photograph is not often enough, so he builds layers of context around his pictures, recording extensive oral histories that provide powerful testimonies that a picture often cannot deliver, quite literally giving a voice to those who have been silenced. Since last year, Robin made 65 portraits across 7 countries on victims of anti-gay discrimination, individuals that are prosecuted by their own governments for simply being themselves. The testimonies he recorded offered powerful reporting that a caption could never deliver. His photographs, coupled with his deep reporting, led to an international cover story in Time magazine this year on LGBT discrimination by the writer Aaron Baker. The story would not have happened without Robin's reporting and insight. Robin's goal is not only to record his subjects' suffering, but to truly improve their lives. He is a modern photojournalist that harnesses the power of social media to create community and incite change. He is the founder of Witness Change, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing human rights through highly visual storytelling. Robin was the W. Eugene Grant recipient in 2013 for work that focused on mental health in Africa, which is a topic he still continues to this day. He is the winner of 4 Amnesty International Awards for Human Rights Journalism, a 2014 World Press Award, and a Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award. He is currently based in Paris, and we are honored to have him with us tonight. Please welcome Robin Hammond.
Thanks, Kira. It was a very nice introduction. It's interesting, Jim, that you talk about Eugene Smith and Minamata. Several years later, that book had a massive influence on me as well. In fact, in 2001, I opened that book and discovered documentary photography with a purpose. And I closed that book and knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Then for the next 10 years, I tried and failed to follow Gene Smith in his footsteps. And then in 2011, I walked into a prison in South Sudan. And this should be a picture anytime now.
was a powerful speech. Thank you very much. Well, I'm here representing the judges from this year's awards, and I can report to you that the process was a breeze. It was actually very easy, and like jumping out of a window was exhilarating, exciting, but the last foot was difficult. That's when things got a little sticky. There were actually very few weak entries. I mean, the Smith's legacy and the reputation of this award has really ensured a very, very solid entry. And most of the submissions were fantastically strong. And our reasons for excluding them were mainly technical. There were things like some were requesting funds that were outside the remit of the award. Some were a little too complete, they were too finished to actually benefit from additional money. Some of them were not sufficiently complete to take them forwards. But selecting that single award, it came down to a number of stories that were phenomenally strong. And like every other place, we wish we could have given just more than one award. And by the way, if there are any funders out there, please be aware that there is enough substantial work there doing real social good, and Robin being one example, that any funds donated will go to a very good cause, believe me. Anyway, the six finalists there were indeed, we felt we wanted to show all six almost equally. We felt they were all winners. They all, in very different ways, displayed what we felt to be so important. Fantastic craft skills, creative vision, emotional power, journalistic passion. And you'll see from the work you're about to look at that they range from the quietest introspective study and a phenomenal piece from Mexico of an artist just studying his own mind and the consequences of the conflict in Mexico in his own environment, through to really structured conflict photography, campaigning work from Central African Republic, and other works you'll see, a huge range of works. And we felt it very important to show the world that the award in the 21st century stands for a spirit. It doesn't stand for a style. We're not trying to award a picture that looks like W. Eugene Smith or a style that mimics that. What we are looking for is the passion that represents that. So please have a look.
I'm Giancarlo Seraudo, I'm from Italy. The name of my project is Destino Finale.
Hi, I'm Bharat Chaudhary. I'm from India. For the past 4 years, I have been working in Europe on a project called The Silence of Others.
I'm Bharat, an Indian photographer based in London, UK. For the past 3 years, I have been working with young Muslims in America and Western Europe. I'm trying to understand the reasons that lead to the alienation of young Muslims in a Western society and what compels them to adopt an isolationist or a radical approach. Why is it that many young Muslims who were born and raised in countries like America, England, or France feel that the West is at war with Islam, and what forces them to respond through violence? I have documented the impact of religious prejudice and stereotyping on young Muslims. I have shared stories of many Muslims who have experienced physical and verbal assaults, and they are now struggling with a psychosocial crisis. Now I am documenting how factors like ethnic profiling, religious discrimination, high unemployment, poor housing, and poverty contribute to the anger and disaffection of young Muslims. I am not a Muslim, and with this work, I am not trying to justify violence in the name of Islam. My simple objective is to understand the problems from the perspective of a young Muslim mind. If we are talking about Muslims, then it is important that we also listen to what they have to say. I hope that my work provides both Muslims and non-Muslims with an opportunity to understand each other. I hope it suggests what we all can do to ensure the full-fledged integration of young Muslims in the Western society.
Hey y'all, my name is Matt Eich. I'm a photographer in Charlottesville, Virginia. You're about to see a short trailer from a project called Sin and Salvation in Baptisttown. It's about the town of Greenwood, Mississippi in the Mississippi Delta, where I've been working for the last 5 years. I'm examining contemporary race and class disparities in a formerly segregated town.
I never lost my joy.
Right.
I never lost my joy.
Yeah.
I never lost my faith.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna keep on holding on. I got up, still sit up in this bed, I said,
My name is Jael Martinez. I am from Guerrero, Mexico. I am working on a project called The House That Bleeds.
The House That Bleeds. A people without memory is condemned to repeat their mistakes. Guerrero is the second poorest and most violent state in the country. Our community is struggling to protect ourselves against the violence, corruption, and crime that seems to be here forever. In Guerrero, the tragedy of this violent Mexico is condensed. In the cities of Iguala and Tasco, we have found many consolate graves, many family members and people who have been buried there for many years. We just want to recover the bodies of our family members who are buried. I am from Guerrero, one of the states in Mexico that has been most affected by violence of organized crime. In 2013, 3 of my brothers-in-law died. They used to live in Iguala, the place where the Ayotzinapa student disappeared. One of them was killed, the other 2 disappeared. After these events, I began documenting my family to capture in photographs the psychological and emotional breakdown caused by the loss of family members, especially for parents, children, and siblings. I am working with the concept of pain, emptiness, absence, and forgetting. I'm seeking social and cultural cues that can allow me to create a personal account of the issues that families face when dealing with unexpected death. Through the story and this particular issue, I want to show the relationship of intimate space to the personal life experience, which is reflected in the social experience. I am thus trying to depict the situation which many families in this region face, which they live through daily, and which is one of the causes of the unraveling of Mexico's social fabric.
I am Majid Saidi, an Iranian photographer based in Kabul, and my project is Life in War.
For the past century, Afghanistan has been involved in various wars and conflicts due to its internal politics, religion, or because other powers sought to conquer these lands. We have seen countless images of Afghanistan, particularly images of soldiers and aid workers throughout the country. But these images don't portray the real Afghanistan in my experience. The real Afghanistan may be an image of a humble child looking at my camera lens without a smile. If you're a photojournalist in Afghanistan, you would get used to seeing these faces. For me, the real Afghanistan would be the smile on the faces of those same children. Or in contrast, an image of women who have set themselves on fire to express their despair about their lives. Images of men, women and children who have lost their arms and legs due to landmines.
Hello, my name is Marcus Bleasdale and I am from the UK. I'm here in Cambridge and my project is concentrating on the Central African Republic and the concept of financing state failure.
Vous avez contacté le Croix-Rouge pour le corps.
On va tout brûler, tout.
Salgado. Le capitaine veut seulement récupérer les armes des gens. Les sélects là sont avec des armes, de grosses armes.
My name is Mary Calvert and I'm from San Francisco, California. My project is The Battle Within, Sexual Assault in America's Military. Women who join the U.S. Armed Forces are being raped and sexually assaulted by their colleagues in record numbers. An estimated 21,000 rapes and sexual assaults took place last year, and only 1 in 7 victims reported their attacks. Many fear retaliation, demotion, or being kicked out of the military because they have seen it happen to others. Many women join the military to serve their country and protect the rights and freedoms of their fellow citizens, only to have their own human rights violated. The violence of the rape and the ensuing emotional trauma are compounded by the futility of reporting the attacks to their commands. Lack of compassion is often the most favorable response a victim of rape can expect. Most military rape survivors are still seeking justice, and all of them struggle to live with the lifelong challenges of military sexual trauma that include depression, substance abuse, paranoia, and feelings of isolation. Survivors often spend years drowning in shame and fear as the psychological damage silently eats away at their lives. Many frequently end up addicted to drugs and alcohol, and some take their own lives. A growing population of these women also end up homeless. Female veterans are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population in the U.S., and are 4 times more likely to become homeless than civilian women. The challenges for homeless women veterans are unique and difficult to address, especially when programs for vets seldom meet the needs of women with children. Single mothers often bounce from one drug-ridden motel to another because many women's shelters will not admit a young man over the age of 12. Many of these women escaped a difficult situation by joining the military, and when they get out, find themselves unable to cope with the stresses of unemployment and a weak economy. My next chapter in this project will document the underreported and hidden survivors of male-on-male rape within the ranks of the U.S. military.
would like to just add a few footnotes to the remarkable work we've just seen. The Mexican work was shot entirely within the photographer's own home, which I think is an inspiration to anyone looking to cover important subjects. Marcus Bleasdale's work came with a complete action plan, a media strategy and a distribution plan to actually effect change in the situation that he's documenting. And Mary's work, her last sentence really astonished the jury. It was a subject that none of us really were aware of, and we certainly had no recognition that people would come forward and talk about these things, but we're absolutely confident that Mary can do this. And for that, sadly, Marcus is not here to receive his award. He's in the UK. But I would like to invite Mary on stage to receive your fellowship. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Photographing the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces has meant more to me than I can adequately express in these words. What began as an idea for a project from my husband Joe has become the most important work of my existence as a photojournalist. For many years, I've walked the halls of various military installations during my role as an instructor for the DoD Military Photographers Workshop. Many times I passed items on bulletin boards, offerings of counseling for sexual assault victims, and 24-hour hotline numbers for those seeking assistance. I used to look at them and wonder, why on earth do they need that? Surely that's not happening in America's military. My shock at the reality has driven my unbroken resolve to tell this story. When I first began this body of work, I thought I could bring about meaningful social change when enough people saw and were moved by the photographs. My hope was that I could contribute something and inspire the U.S. military, the White House and Capitol Hill to prosecute those committing these crimes and bring about justice to the victims. But change happens very, very slowly. I now hope that I'm part of a groundswell in the movement to end sexual assault in America's military. Recently, the U.S. Supreme Court made a landmark decision on gay marriage, but that did not happen because of just one person's efforts. The case brought before the court was by a group of people. Like the first part of the project, I hope this next chapter will be published all over the world, but I want to take it further. I want to utilize social media, video, and other platforms that will motivate people to pass the information around, inspiring more people to come forward out of the shadows to tell their stories and bring pressure on officials who have the power to change things. I'd like to thank the board of the Eugene Smith Memorial Fund, my beloved husband Joe, my friends at Zuma Press, and the brave men and women of the United States military who trusted me to tell their stories. Thank you very much.
Great work tonight. I'm here to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. We know David Remnick as a great editor of a great magazine, The New Yorker, where he's won more than 36 national magazine awards. We know him as a writer and a journalist whose book, On the Last Days of the Soviet Union, Lenin's Tomb, earned him the Pulitzer Prize. We know his own work for The New Yorker, stories on subjects as diverse as the Middle East and Muhammad Ali, on jazz and Barack Obama, the subject of David's 2011 book, The Bridge. And those who attended last week's New Yorker Festival in this very room know him in his new role as a guitarist. You can check him out on thenewyorker.com. David played on stage, this very stage, with Patti Smith playing Because the Night. But for all this, we forget sometimes how important he's been to photography. For decades, the New Yorker never ran a single photograph. But the visual age demanded camera-rendered images, and under David's stewardship, the magazine has been responsible for enduring portraiture and photojournalism, including stories by the likes of Gilles Perez and Paolo Pellegrin and Chrisanne Johnson, all of them recipients of the W. Eugene Smith Grant. David's track record in supporting photographers harkens back to some of the great magazine commissions during the heyday of Life and Fortune. Here, then, a champion of photography and a friend of photographers, David Remnick.
Just be glad you didn't hear that guitar situation. You know, I had 5 minutes to rehearse this with Patti Smith, and I was sitting there, and she was standing here, and I thought she would be terribly merciful. And I started to play, and she looked at me and she said, "I do it slower." So much for mercy. First of all, I want to say how thrilled I am to be here tonight. All of the work we've seen is astonishing, and I get the bonus as an editor of peeking at some of this work ahead of time, some of it before it's published. And you can be sure that I will alert the authorities at the New Yorker about what's going on in the world, and thank you for that. It's an enormous pleasure to be here tonight, a night on which we honor an art that is said to be endangered by its own profusion. It's said that the capacity for every soul on earth to take reasonable images with his or her smartphone somehow threatens to crowd out photography as an art. This is, please forgive me, brothers and sisters, a well-packed bag of bullshit. The images of the true artist, the images of the greatest of all photographers, are no more threatened by what I take on my iPhone than the writings of Toni Morrison or Philip Roth are threatened by my capacity to scroll a grocery list on the back of an envelope. Great artists and great images will somehow, even amidst all the visual cacophony of contemporary life, they will cut through. It's a wonderful thing that a passionate amateur in a unique position can add, even significantly at times, to the world's visual knowledge of its beauty or its horror. The images of the moon that we saw just last week for the first time that were released by NASA were astonishing and add to the breadth of our imagination of the universe in which we exist. The images of ISIS in Raqqa, taken by the brave, disguised citizen journalists, anonymous people in Syria who go by the collective name Raqqa is being slaughtered silently, fuel our nightmares, and they make sure that we know what horror exists on this globe and insist that we do something about it. Whenever I look at the New Yorker's Instagram page and many other pages like it all over the place, places where all manner of photographers and archivists post images, I am repeatedly astonished not only by the pictures, but by the democratizing impulse of the technology itself. This is an excellent thing, and it really is of a piece with the democratizing effect had over time by technologies as varied as the printing press, the radio, television, and the electric guitar. But the capacity to reach more people, to empower more picture takers, to expand the range of expression, even to popularize, does nothing to undermine the authority of genius and uniqueness. And we've seen a lot of that tonight. To suppose that the extraordinary photographers in this room are losing their footing in the world is to suppose the same thing of poets, novelists, and the best journalists, as if they were being put out of commission by the democratizing technologies of Twitter or Facebook. I'm honored to be here with you tonight. Photography, as this evening acknowledges and celebrates, is an essential art, essential to our mental vision of the unfathomable range of life. Photography runs in my family. My father eased his boredom in his job by spending his nights and his weekends in his darkroom. Both of my sons went to programs at ICP and even had the great good fortune of studying with various teachers, including Mary Ellen Mark. My elder son, God help him, makes his living as a news photographer, racing around the state of New Jersey all day long, from high school football game to 3-alarm fire to hip-hop concerts to press conferences, filing from the front seat all the while. He is learning your craft. And why should I discourage him? He is entering a great tradition. When I began my work as an editor 17 years ago, by far, the most powerful personalities I worked with for years were photographers. Richard Avedon, whose final chapter as a singular artist was to be the first and for a while the only photographer for The New Yorker. Gilles Perez, whose images of the Iranian Revolution, the troubles in Ireland, and the war in the Balkans are as lasting as any writing about those same terrible events. Sylvia Plackey, who for a time marked our pages nearly every week with images of street life in New York, and the dear Mary Ellen Mark, a brilliant and versatile artist who we lost this past year, a wonderful woman, an artist. Now, when I was a writer and going on foreign journeys, sometimes to very dangerous places, it was always my pleasure to work with photographers who always had a much better and almost unerring instinct for when to get out. They always went close, and yet their instinct and their experience in these matters was, to me, better than any flak jacket I could be wearing. But I learned other things by working with photographers. And when I was a writer for the magazine, Tina Brown had the wit and the good sense to introduce photography into the pages of The New Yorker, as David said, which had never had a single photograph, not one, until then, of any major, certainly of any major range, until Avedon came along, and she used an unassailable artist who also came with one of the great archives in the history of the post-war America. And it was my great fortune to be assigned to write a profile of Marion Barry, the infinitely complicated mayor of Washington who had gone to prison and then was coming out of prison, and in a kind of redemption story, an attempted redemption, he ran for mayor again, and I followed him around for weeks. And it was Tina's idea to have Richard Avedon take a picture of Marion Barry, and it was my job to get him to come to New York. Only with Avedon do you get the subject to come to his city rather than you go down to Washington. And I convinced Marion Barry and his then wife, Cora Masters, who was, and Barry by this time was mayor again, and Cora Masters was his wife and also the boxing and wrestling commissioner in Washington, D.C., for which he was paid handsomely, and there's no boxing or any wrestling in Washington, D.C. And they arrived at Avedon's studio more or less on time on East 70-something Street, in his townhouse, which was like a factory. It was almost like Andy Warhol's factory, but with no drugs or anything like that. And Marion arrived, and he and Cora went straight to the bathroom for what I would call an unusual amount of time. And afterwards, he came out, and I was ready to see, was going to see a master work, and I thought this was going to take hours. I thought this was going to, we were going to see how the real shit is done. And he had Marion Barry step in front of the camera, and he said, "Move your head a little bit like this." And he went, click. And then he said, "We better take one for safety." Click. And that was it. And then he said, "David, jump in there with Cora, and Marion will take one for you." And the subsequent print shows me to be the whitest man in the history of the United States, because obviously Avedon had, what he had done, of course, was study for days and days, not only the visual properties of what could come up, but what he wanted and what he wanted to see in Marion Barry. And I needn't tell you that the ensuing print was spectacular. He had that capacity to see. And the people in this room are not using their iPhones and simply having the good fortune of having a moment. They're not NASA astronauts who are trained to use a camera 5 minutes before and are blessed with unbelievable vistas. You are artists. You can see, and if I've learned anything by working with photographers, they can do something that I cannot readily imagine. When I became editor of The New Yorker a few years later, a process that took a matter of a weekend, and it was an enormous surprise to me, having never been the editor of anything other than my high school newspaper, I got a phone message from Richard Avedon: "Please come to my studio, I have something to show you." I thought, this is pretty awesome. I'm going to be telling John Updike, we're taking your piece, we're not taking your piece. The vanity of it was enormous, and now I was going to go to Updike's studio and render judgment on his work that he's only been doing for 50 years before. And Avedon barely knew me, and he wanted, and he was a great seducer. And I arrived at this place in the 70s, and he fed everybody that would come. He would have as many assistants scurrying around, and they would pick the absolute proper thing. And I came, and on a platter with the most exquisite little lox and bagels you've ever seen. It worked. And we went upstairs to his exhibition area, and there before me was, I had heard rumors that this project at enormous expense had been executed about religions and religious fanaticism all over the world, was a photograph almost the size of this movie screen here. It was just gigantic, of an Indian holy man with a gigantic brick hanging from his penis. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, why not? And thus ran some of the most bizarre photographs in the history of The New Yorker. The great pleasure of being an editor is to say yes. And these days, when I look through Dick Avedon's books, I see and I recognize not only what he does, but what you all do, which is to say, when I think of his heyday, when I think of the 60s and the 70s and those images of Ezra Pound as a madman, or Bert Lahr as a clown, or Marilyn Monroe in her profound sadness, or James Baldwin with his eyes of intense awareness of the world going on all around him and the pain within, I realize that when I think of all those figures, important figures in all of our cultural imaginations, in our political awareness, you see them sometimes first and foremost in that 1/8 of a second in which Avedon captured them. And so too with so many of these pictures when we think of whether it's sexual assault or African American life in America or the drought in California, and innumerable situations, visions of beauty, political circumstances, we think first and foremost of your work. And that is an amazing thing. All photographs, Susan Sontag once wrote, are memento mori. To take a photograph is to participate in another person's or thing's mortality, vulnerability, and mutability. Precisely by slicing out this moment and freezing it, all photographs testify to time's relentless melt. So I just want to conclude by saying, as an editor and as a citizen, I'm tremendously grateful to you all. To have the chance to work with and see the work of so many brilliant photographers and to work with so many brilliant photography editors has been and remains a privilege. Look at the amplitude of things. Think of the range of human imagery provided by you and your brothers and sisters in this art. Artists like Moises Simon, whose remarkable work in the Middle East refuses our attempts to forget. Or Stephanie Sinclair, who's been working for years on a project about child marriage all over the world. Or Alex Soth, who roams the center of the country in search of the strange, the new. He is an American poet of a kind. Or think of Matt Black, who may end up having an excellent evening in front of him if he has the patience, who did such remarkable work making the drought in California come alive in all its crackly bleakness in the pages of The New Yorker. Photography lives. Thank you for it, and have a great night.
So I think David Remnick just gave Tom Garber, our Chapnick Grant recipient, his extended headline. Pixel Nation, a tightly bound bag of bullshit. You got to use that, man. You got to talk to Remnick and see if he'll let you do it. So it has been a great honor for me to be a part of the board of Smith, and this year Marcel asked me if I would chair the jury, and I was like, okay, now it's gone from honor to responsibility. That's a big responsibility. The first thing I did is I said, Marcel, I'll do it, but you got to let me pick the jury. And he said, okay, that sounds like a fair deal. So my first call was to Stephen Mays. I was like, man, this guy's super smart. I got to protect myself. Got to get really bright people around me. My second call was to John Temple. So John couldn't be with us tonight. You got a chance to hear from Stephen earlier about the judging process, which was, hard, as you can imagine, looking at all that work, trying to figure out, how do you whittle that down to a single recipient. So that's what we're going to close with tonight is the recipient. And his story is amazing. The stat is crazy. 45 million Americans are living below the poverty line. That number is so huge, it's hard to get your head around it. And that's the thing about statistics that drive me crazy. You can't care about them in a way. Stalin said this really well. He said the death of a single person is a tragedy. The death of a million people is a statistic. And this is our job in photojournalism, is to humanize that data, put a human face on that data. An image has the power to create empathy, to open eyes, to touch hearts, to call people to action. That is the power of our craft. Matt Black's work is deeply rooted in the traditions of photojournalism. He makes visually sophisticated images, sure, but the thing is, he's a committed journalist who does extensive research. That's at the core of his storytelling, is the research. He's also markedly modern in his approach. And this is what I really love about what Matt's been able to do. He's built incredible partnerships with like-minded organizations like MSNBC, the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and the Magnum Foundation. Not a bad cadre to be working with. He's prolific in social media. His must-see Instagram feed has more than 180,000 followers. Think about that. That's bigger than most newspapers in the United States. That makes him like a publishing powerhouse. He can go direct to his audience. Matt is exactly what I believe Eugene Smith would be like if he was working in today's media landscape. He was named Time Magazine's Instagram Photographer of the Year in 2014. In June, he became a nominee member of Magnum Photos. Today, he becomes the 36th recipient of the W. Eugene Smith Memorial Fund in Humanistic Photography to continue work on his project, The Geography of Poverty. So he's had a pretty good year. He's had some pretty amazing recognitions. The thing that's really great about Matt is that he's just a really, really good person. And I think great photographers, man, if you get to the core of their work, you look underneath it, it's who they are as people. So let's take a look at Matt's work.
My name is Matt Black, and I'm a photographer. Most of my work is focused on California's Central Valley, the rural agricultural region where I'm from. It's home to some of the country's poorest communities. But after time spent focusing my work on the Central Valley, I became curious about how many other places these sorts of conditions exist. There are 46 million people living in poverty in the U.S. Since the year 2000, the number of people living in communities of concentrated poverty has doubled. This summer, I took a 3-month cross-country trip in which I visited over 70 of these communities of concentrated poverty, seeking to photograph poverty not in isolation, but in a nationwide context, and exploring the connections and commonalities between these places. How would what I've been photographing in California connect to what's going on in Appalachia, for example, or the Dakotas, or Michigan, or in South Texas? After this trip, I see all of these communities as connected. It's all one thing, and it all shows something that I've felt since the beginning, that at a time of ever concentrating wealth at the top, there are huge swaths of this country that are being left behind.
Matt, check for you. It is my honor to welcome to the stage someone who represents all of the passion, values, and commitment that Gene Smith embodied throughout his career, Matt Black. It is in there, man. Check is in there. Take this.
It's been a long night, so I'll keep this short. But it's just a huge honor to be standing here. I have a few thanks I'd just like to say, which is thanking the board, of course, of the Gene Smith Fund for this big honor, and my wife, Melissa Black, for being my wife and partner. Also, Amy Pereira at MSNBC for supporting this work. And just one observation I'd like to say is that, over the course of this project, I traveled about 18,000 miles covering the country, and I saw, a lot of changes, a lot of diversity in our nation. But the similarities I saw is what stands out to me. And I think those similarities is what underscore our connectedness. And I think that's the point of this work, is that being alive in this world is that we're all connected and we're all in this together. So, thank you very much.
Well, despair or paralysis, or, as Gene Smith would have said, hope and action. That's how I hope we all leave here tonight. Allow me to thank the sponsors that make the fund possible and make the grants possible. There are quite a few. Anastasia Photo, Aperture, Brilliant Graphics, who produced the program tonight, Canon USA, the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, the Harbers Family Foundation, the International Center of Photography, MediaStorm, Photo District News, the School of Visual Arts, our hosts tonight, the Swann Auction Gallery, Synergy Communications, it's our publicist. All of these organizations have people attached to them that have taken a personal interest in the Smith Fund. So how can you take an interest? If you want to leave here with action, you can donate to our fund. And if you raise the lights, I don't know if you can do that up there, raise the lights a little bit. In your program, the very back of your program, there is a card. And you'll have to pull that card off the inside cover. It's a Robin Hammond image. And on the back of that card, you can make a donation if you desire. And the ushers, they're at the doors. They have big bags that say School of Visual Arts. You can give them your card. They will also be in the lobby at the table. Otherwise, we almost have a full house. This is great. I want to thank you for coming. And if you do donate, I thank you in advance. Enjoy the reception, have a glass of wine, and again, hope and action. Thank you.